Yes, it does. Is, is that right?
Right. Welcome, everybody. I see people are coming online now. The chat function is open, so if you want to let us know where you're from, it will be lovely to see where everyone comes from around the world. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. There is the Q&A function is also open. It's better to put your questions in the Q&A function. If you can't find your function buttons, just click on the Alt button. That'll bring up all of your functionality. Q&A is better for your questions and answers because then we don't lose it amongst the chat on the side. You're welcome to share your some information, additional supporting information in the chat function, but please no marketing or any kind of promotion in the chat function. That would be wonderful. Thank you. The reactions are also open. If you like something that somebody's saying, please use the reactions, clap your hands, thumbs up. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm just going to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the ESG Exchange, and welcome to everybody to the ESG Exchange today. I'm going to share my screen just to show you our website and take you through our website. So if you go to theesgexchange.org, and there's a little bit on the About page about us. The ESG Exchange is an initiative that was founded by Professor Mervyn King. Professor Mervyn King is a senior counsel and former judge of the Supreme Court of South Africa. He's also the founding patron of the Good Governance Academy and our initiative, the ESG Exchange. A little bit on our purpose. Our purpose is to rapidly globalize scarce sustainability reporting know-how, including the fiduciary duties for that we're going to be speaking about today. And we bring that to the rest of the world as a public good through a tech-enabled collaborative exchange, which we'll be launching towards the end of this year. There are two areas to our mission. The first is to convene the global ecosystem of organizations all participating in helping corporates around the world and any size and type of organization in any industry around the world to provide sustainability information. Sustainability information in a way that is comparable, repeatable over time, assurable, and decision useful, as well as digital information. We do that through these organizations by convening the experts, and there are very few experts around the world, as you know, even though everyone on LinkedIn seems to have ESG in their profile title now these days. But the experts are convened under the technical committee that are producing how-to playbooks for the world to access in terms of sustainability reporting. If you want to know more about us, please go to this About page. And if you are an expert, please join our technical committee. So without any further ado, and we're 3 minutes into this webinar today, I'd like to welcome Adam Wasserman, who is our co-host today, is FinPublica. And we'd like to thank Adam very much for co-hosting this event with us and for FinPublica's distribution to its members. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Adam. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here with you, with the ESG Exchange, and with all of your members. And if I can put you on the spot, and if you're able to share the screen with the FinPublica website, www.finpublica.org, I'll give just a brief introduction as to what FinPublica is. So FinPublica is a nonprofit platform that works to inspire and empower finance leaders from around the globe to achieve their environmental, social, and governance goals. And we're trying to do this by, number one, cultivating a deeply engaged community, two, providing accessible and expansive content, and three, serving as a catalyst for action. Our goal is to bring people at all stages from the finance industry in their ESG journey together so they can collaborate, work with, learn from, and help each other actualize their own goals and initiatives. The other thing that we do, if Karen goes to the very top of the page, is we work to collect under one roof summaries of key ESG issues all in one place, so people can quickly get up to speed on topics of interest to you. So there are a variety of topics, tools, policies, guides, and disclosures, research, and the like. And what we do is we compile things from all over the web. We try to put it in more of a summary wrapper so you can get up to speed in minutes rather than hours, but then always dig deeper if you want to go into an additional topic. So again, pleasure to be here with all of you. And it's my honor to turn it over to my co-panelist, William Frater, who's going to discuss the panel and introduce all of our expert panelists here today.
Hello, welcome everybody. We've got a remarkable group of people here, and I think that I'm really quite excited about this discussion because we have an asset owner, we have a legal expert, we have asset advisor, and we have an academic, all discussing fiduciary duties. And there are no service providers in this particular discussion. So firstly, let me talk about Fiona Datoch, and she's a legal expert. She's a barrister in practice at the UK Bar. She's the founder and legal director of Protimos, an organization that works to ensure that the law is used effectively, at present mainly in Africa, to reduce poverty and to implement the Sustainable Development Goals through community legal empowerment and through apex judge thought leadership. Fiona did a lot of work with the late Professor Watchman on climate justice and ESG. And I think you'll probably all remember the Freshfields report that came out of the PRI, one of the most influential reports with regard to fiduciary responsibility. Certainly she hopes to continue some of this work in the future. The next person is Paul Lee. Paul has a long history in the ESG space. He's currently head of stewardship and sustainable investment strategy at Reddington, which is a very, very large investment consultant based out of London. And he is advising pension schemes and other owners on their investment approaches. His background is being one of the founding members of the Hermes team, one of the co-founders of Hermes EOS. He worked in Aberdeen Asset Management, and he's engaged with companies throughout the world, explaining to board directors the perspectives of long-term shareholders. And he's been very deeply involved in policy matters in the UK and beyond, related to the Companies Act. He currently sits on the UK Endorsement Board, which is responsible for approving accounting standards. He also has a remarkable blog on fairness, and it's called Sense of Fairness, and I find it one of the most insightful and interesting blogs around. Then we have Shiva Rangapal, who is an academic. He is the Kester and Bernskett Professor at the Columbia Business School. He is a world-renowned expert on ESG, financial reporting issues, fraud, executive compensation, corporate culture, and corporate governance. He's also recognized, he's been internationally recognized for his scholarship on a number of occasions. And he's certainly one of the key things that he is interested in doing is pulling, bridging the gap between academic theory and corporate practice. He's got a regular column at Forbes and has published widely. He advises think tanks, asset management firms, and advisory firms, as well as professional and trade associations. And finally, and I hope Treasurer Davis has come in. She was unfortunately caught behind a car accident. Treasurer Davis has had 2 terms as the elected state treasurer for Delaware since 2018. Since taking office, she has focused on 3 main priorities: bolstering retirement security and readiness, creating pathways for economic empowerment, and promoting a culture of financial excellence. The highlights from her first term include maintaining Delaware's AAA bond rating, expanding access to retirement saving for people who weren't previously covered, She sits, aside from being the financial manager for a state, she sits on multiple national, regional, and federal advisory and oversight bodies, including the State Employees Benefit Committee and the Plans Management Board. So Treasurer Davis could be said to be presenting the views of an asset owner, and also someone who has considerable experience as a financial consultant with a lot of success in healthcare funding. Adam, has Treasurer Davis arrived? Should we?
Yes, the treasurer has arrived, but I think given how global this audience is, I think it makes sense. Let's start with the global perspective, and then we can work our way to the US perspective afterwards and sort of see the compare and contrast between how things are done in the rest of the world versus the strange issues we are coping with here in the United States. So I'll turn it over to you, William, to begin with the global fiduciary duty perspectives.
So I think I'm going to throw the first question at Fiona. Fiona, can you introduce fiduciary duties just so that we all are clear of what we're talking about generally, and how they're viewed and established throughout in the world as we see from a global perspective.
Fiona, you're on mute.
Fiona?
How's that? Sorry, I thought I was being considerate, and then I forgot and wasted time instead. This is, of course, an absolutely tiny question. Well, we had a meeting in preparation for this webinar, and it provoked me. I had originally going to be looking at UK and compared with the EU, which of course is now an exercise in comparison. And I thought I would also add in a very small, but nevertheless, in my view, crucial glance at where fiduciary duty appears in general, and in particular appears in the Chinese canon of fiduciary duties and how you define them. So if one simply, and then I then had another look, and I realized that the manifestation in law of fiduciary duty depends extremely heavily on the legal system within which it operates. So that instantly makes the question very, very tricky to answer with any kind of generalized approach. Safe to say that in China, there is a good deal of customary law as well as statutory law. And my knowledge of the UK legal structures revealed that, in fact, there is a code of conduct in China which governs the way in which their companies behave. And guess where I found that reflected? But in the Companies Act of the UK in 2006. So there's a huge amount of aspirational policy making and incentives moving towards disclosure in the Chinese system, but a definition of the fiduciary duty as applied to across the board in China is actually quite difficult to determine, and remains, as it does in very many other places, an area of uncertainty, which has an absolute fascination for the people who are trying to engage with it. So it's constantly being tilted at. And if indeed you look at what we've got in the UK in section 172, a director of a company must act, I'm looking at the director's fiduciary duty at the moment. The director of a company must act in the way he considers in good faith would be most likely to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, and then having regard to the likely consequences of any decision in the long term. So that opens the gate to a whole stack of obligations. Whether it opens the gate to a set of obligations which, if breached, could lead to some sort of enforcement mechanism is quite another question, because the prosecution of such an offence would have to be deemed to be in the public interest before it could take off. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if it were a shareholders' action, then it would have to have all kinds of elements to it which were considered to be vital. So I thought what I would look at doing is saying, okay, so China's on its way, it's aware, it's looking at stuff, and it's looking around to see who else is doing what, and bolting that on to the way in which it's aiming at the way forward. And I would say in particular that there are going to be huge challenges in terms of disclosure when China gets to that, for reasons that are, how does one articulate? Because it doesn't lie very comfortably and easily in the Chinese wholesale political approach to things, to say across the board, this disclosure is therefore a good thing, capital A, capital G, capital T, which is what we say it is in the UK. There's huge latitude given within the UK, in marked contrast to the latitude that is available to corresponding locations of fiduciary duty in France. Now, may I, William, just pop along to France, or have you got another question brewing? I can see a question on your face.
No. Well, I mean, I think just deal with France, because we've got two different legal systems. We've got.
I was going to go to that, exactly.
And and they're different approaches, and I would love you to briefly deal with that.
But no, I'm all poised to do so. So here is the challenge for any non-lawyers listening in. There are at present two different legal systems operating across the world. The greater number of legal systems are reflected in what's called civil code. And in civil code countries, it isn't such a quarrelsome business as it is in common law countries. And that is because there is an assumption that law can be made, first of all, by a governing body, and then reflected in administrative responsibility and judicial validation or judgment of one sort or another. What is absolutely missing from the civil code is the arena which lies at the very heart of decision making in a common law jurisdiction. So if we want to argue about something in the UK, the end game is to go to court. And then when you're in court, it's an adversarial process. And that is in complete contrast to what there is within common law jurisdictions. It's quite difficult for those people brought up and steeped in the common law process to understand how the other system can work. But they both work, no two ways about it. I mean, a simple example is that a judge in the French system decides early on, I think I'd rather be a judge than an advocate. And so I'm going to go to judge training school. I'm going to learn how to be a judge. And when the issue comes before me, I'll hear representations. I certainly won't be watching a dogfight in the courtroom. And I'll be going off into my, to have my nice lunch and sit and think about it. And then I'll come back and tell everybody what the answer is. It's a remarkably peaceful process. However, in common law, there's an adversarial approach taken, and what it lands up meaning is that 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 20 people on one side, 6 people on the other, or 20, and they land up having a dogfight, and because they're testing the strength of the argument on both sides. So the battle that goes on in the judge's head is a relatively peaceful, unstressed matter. Well, it may not be, but you know what I'm saying. Whereas in the common law jurisprudence, people are testing it all the time. Now, what that takes you to, in my view, is that the fiduciary duty premium is higher in a common law jurisdiction. It means that what constitutes fiduciary duty is something which gradually develops over the course of time. There are some absolute ground-based rules, namely the things that you can find in the Companies Act and so forth. But largely speaking, if you're looking at fiduciary duty, which manifests itself in the duty of care in a British court, as Paul Watchman, and my favourite case ever was the snail in the ginger beer bottle. If he was sitting here, and I hope that he is at some level, he would be talking immediately about the development of the duty of care, and he would talk about how that grows into obligations of one sort or another, which then connect up with all kinds of aspects of things which are actually already being anticipated and legislated for within the EU.
Now, thank you so much, Fiona. And just being cognizant of time, William, I think you had another.
Oh, sorry,
question
have I gone on too long?
On
No.
ESG.
I just wanted to throw a question at Paul at this time, because now, Paul, Fiona's described the fiduciary duty. How do you see ESG factors fitting in with fiduciary duties in the global context?
So Fiona's talked about fiduciary duty very much from the corporate director's perspective, and I tend to come at it from the investor's perspective inevitably. And but in the same way that Fiona says, you know, we do have to think on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, because this is a legal construct, and therefore fiduciary duty must be a national issue to a large extent. You can also look at it from a global perspective, and I think investors increasingly do, framed by a whole range of global standards and expectations that are being built up both by the investment community itself and also by governments in the rules that they set in international treaties and so on. So you can think about the principles for responsible investment, PRI, that William's already mentioned, who have set a frame to help international investors think about their duty as fiduciaries to look after the assets on behalf of the beneficiaries that they are beholden to. But you can also think about standards that emerge from things like the UN Global Compact, but also the treaties that we have on arms control. So one of the most consistent exclusions from investors' portfolios are manufacturers of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions. Doesn't tend to be an issue in the US, but in most other markets, those are investments that no institution is willing to make, because there's been international standard setting by way of arms control treaties that are then reflected by investors into their own investment approach. Very much consistent with fiduciary duty, but it's arising from these global standards rather than that jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. We're seeing. Go on, sorry, go on, William.
Oh, no, carry on, sorry.
So I think we're seeing those sorts of standards developing in the human rights area, in modern slavery expectations. There are increasing expectations set by governments on a national basis, but also on an international basis, on companies and investors to have a duty of vigilance, to look into their portfolios, and for companies to look into their supply chains, to think about the risks that their businesses and their investments face from these very challenging issues. And an investor can only think about fiduciary duty by incorporating considerations of some of these issues increasingly, just as a company director can increasingly only think about their duties to the corporation to promote the success of the corporation by incorporating thinking about some of these issues.
Fantastic, thank you, Brad. And if one is looking at, say, the investment advice or the expectation that asset owners are placing on investors, or asset advisors placing on asset managers, are you seeing that this is a mechanism for ensuring that these things are implemented, that the fiduciary duties are implemented by corporate directors?
Yeah, increasingly so. I think you increasingly see a chain of accountability being put in place from the asset owner through the fund manager to the corporation, each step of that chain holding the next one to account for delivering both long-term value creation within the business and within the portfolio, but also addressing those key ESG risks in order to deliver that value over the long-term time horizon that matters to the asset owner. And that's the crucial mindset that's necessary to make this work and function, and to pull those ESG issues through the fiduciary chain, if you like, thinking about the time horizon that really matters to the beneficiaries. Given that most of the monies that we're talking about are invested on behalf of individuals for their pensions decades into the future, thinking about that sort of time horizon out to 20, 30 years is necessary to deliver on fiduciary duty. That inevitably encompasses issues of climate change, issues around social risks, human rights, and so on, because they will go to value over those time horizons.
That's fantastic. Adam.
No, so thank you. So I really appreciate, Fiona and Paul, your perspectives both on the UK, the EU, China, and the rest of the world. Let's now, I guess, travel across the pond to where I'm located in the United States. And if I could just ask Professor Rajagopal, could you just introduce what fiduciary duties are generally and how they're established here in the US?
Oh, thank you, Adam. So I'm trained as an Indian chartered accountant. So a lot of what Fiona said came back to me, my dreaded exams and so on. But having said that, it's a bit more limited here. I mean, she used some interesting words about, I forget the exact words, but the only thing that kept occurring to me was, it's relatively limited in the US. I mean, it's pretty much the same duty of care, duty of loyalty. The states have their own thing, but by and large, it's kind of similar. But you don't hear words like stakeholders. You don't hear, good faith. It's narrower, more legalistic, and the whole. If you want to investigate the whole Delaware question, which we can, if you want. But just to summarize, similar but narrower would be my, quick assessment.
And then as far as ESG considerations, how do those fit in or dovetail or factor into one's fiduciary duties, both as a director or as a investment advisor?
I think this goes back to the point that Paul was making eloquently. It's all time horizon. So if you look at several Republican bills, I think this is the crucial distinction, unarticulated distinction between the two sides. So they'll have things which say the SEC should only rule on material factors. Material from whose standpoint? I mean, is it like a momentum trader who gets in and out of stocks in 25 minutes? Or is it somebody who's running a target fund, payable in 2050, which is automatically a 30-year horizon? So once the horizon conversation gets clearer, then I think the argument against motivating ESG as a value-based proposition, which is future cash flows and risks, which is what the Republicans by and large want to restrict this conversation to, it becomes a bit easier. So it's all, and again, this is not easy to figure out, right? I mean, the US system is very complicated. In general, long-term active as an asset class is kind of disappearing the way of the dodo. So most of the money is held through indexes and ETFs. Index makers have a lot of power here. So whose responsibility is it to worry about these things? Is the pension fund? Is it the index maker? I mean, it gets much more complicated, which if you want, we can get into, but bottom line, it's all time horizon, and that's probably the dispute.
So turning to somebody who does have the responsibility to think about these things for an entire state, Treasurer Davis, you serve as essentially the CFO for the state of Delaware, a state in which more than 60% of our Fortune 500 companies are incorporated. I'm just wondering, how do you consider environmental, social, and governance factors in light of your fiduciary duties? And are there any practical examples that you can give relating to this approach?
Well, I think, again, I think that Professor Rajgopal pointed it out very well, right? We're investing for the long term. And actually every investment that we look at, whether it's in a retirement fund or if it's for our citizens in general, and we're doing infrastructure investing and bond issuance, all of those are a longer outlook, right? And so I do think that from the perspective of our fiduciary duty, this, an ESG strategy absolutely falls in alignment with that long-term concept, that long-term strategy. And I think, unfortunately, there are a number of folks who are looking at it from a slightly different lens and sort of politicizing this process. The thing that I think is kind of interesting, and again, this is a little bit of a political bend, unfortunately, that's being sort of kicked around. But it's interesting that the concern didn't quite raise itself until we started to see markets essentially taking advantage of an ESG label, whether it was the E, the S, or the G. And that really indicated to most investors that there was an opportunity and a real marketing value to that particular label. I think that it all kind of comes down to the other piece of it. In my mind, it comes down to how valuable is the data that we're looking at. Again, to the point of, if we're investing in ETFs and mutual funds, what's in there? And I think it's really kind of the deeper dive that we're getting to today. And it's what makes today's environment look so interesting to investors that are seeking out that true E, S, and G. So when I think about strategy and some of our portfolio managers, I really want to see exactly what they're doing. I want them kind of bringing in their data, demonstrating what that target point is and how they're planning to get there over the longer term. And so we want to see sort of that 20, 30-year outlay. And we want to see sort of what's that impact that you've made over the last 3 years, 5 years, since you started this strategy. And I think one of the things that we've sort of best been able to see is the social part. That's the impact that has been most interesting for us, and would love to kind of continue to see that. Some of the reason I say that is because I think the environmental scope has again a lens, and I think the environmental scope has been done pretty well up to today. And so our interest has begun to sort of push the margin on the social piece.
If I can ask, so what are some of the social issues that you're considering, and how does that play into your investments?
Yeah, so we tend to look at a variety of different things, but I'll give you a little bit more of an example of something that we were looking at fairly recently. Sort of looking at sort of incorporating into our strategy. And sometimes we hear from folks that are innovating, which I think is a really neat place to be when you talk about being someone who's a policymaker. I sort of feel like this is the collaborative space we want to be in, where we're sort of connected with investors that are looking for some of these opportunities, as well as the innovative private industry that's trying to make some of it happen. And I think that, so again, I'll give you this one example, and I'll try not to be too specific, just because it's probably best that I'm not promoting one particular entity over another. But an outfit that's looking to sort of circumvent some of the corruption that's happening in developing nations in Africa. And so they have a design of creating microgrids to essentially electrify very rural areas of a couple of different nations in Africa. And again, sort of circumventing some of the challenges that we see inside of the coal industry, some of the blackouts that we're seeing across different nations. And this is where we like to sort of focus on what are you doing? What's the impact that you're making in the US, in my local community, just down the street? And so I talk about some of the global stuff because it's a little easier for me to get at without giving away too much information. But those are the kinds of things we want to see. We want to know, how are you actually getting into this particular community, this rural area of, of a developing nation? And in particular, what's the training going to look like? How is this actually going to impact the people that are here? How is this technology going to be able to not only electrify the area, but help to produce upward economic mobility in these areas? And so that's a great one, very intriguing story. And again, a combination of sort of seeing innovation and investment come together.
That's fantastic, considering it seems to really integrate the E, the S, and also the governance with the corruption, the G, all together. But you mentioned politicization. And so, Professor, taking on that small topic, I was wondering if you could talk about how some politicians in the United States have argued that considering ESG factors actually violates one fiduciary's duties. What are the heart of those arguments?
Well, the central argument seems to be that asset managers are effectively circumventing the democratic process. So, if maybe it's the remit of Congress to consider environmental policy, or maybe, diversity, equity, inclusion, and so on, or whether you should be pro or anti-labor organized companies. And since no one elected these so-called asset managers, the claim is that they have no jurisdiction, and this is best left to the political process.
Which is interesting, because when I think myself about what I consider to be one of the traditional messages of the Republican Party and capitalism, it's basically businesses should be allowed to make their own choices when it comes to their operations. And here you now have governments who are saying, well, no, we're going to try to substitute our judgment for the corporations. But Professor, I guess, what is your view on ESG and ways that you can consider ESG that's consistent with your fiduciary duties?
So as I said, once the horizon conversation is clearer, I think a lot of the conceptual confusion hopefully goes away, right? So how can human rights be value add or value destroying? I mean, you've seen Nike as an example when word spread that they unfortunately use child labor in Cambodia and Pakistan. It was almost a death blow to their stock, and they had to come back, for instance. That's one of the more extreme examples, and you can think of so many in the here and the now in terms of climate related shocks to agricultural industries, cruise operators, mines, perhaps even oil and gas. What should Exxon do 20 years from now if there is a demand shock, meaning people will consume less oil and so on? And I want to comment on your other point you made, Adam, about, business to me is inherently a political and a social construct. These are just made up entities that we've come up with as a way to deal with things like limited liability. And this area is full of contradictions. If that is indeed the case, can we get some more disclosure on, say, political lobbying, which the Republicans absolutely do not want to have anything to do with? And I'll just put in one more quick plug for one of the papers I wrote. I was trying to figure out, for $1 of political lobbying, what might the payoff be? It's, as far as I can tell, it's anywhere between 10 and 20x. The payoff to $1 of R&D is probably 2x, and that's not even risk adjusted. So we are under investing in lobbying, if anything. So we should actually see more lobbying, not less. So how about some disclosure on that, right?
Now, Treasurer, do you think these anti-ESG movements in the United States are just a flash in the pan and they're going to fizzle out soon? Or do you think that there is work that ESG proponents need to do if they want to promote an environment that is hospitable to the idea of sustainable finance?
Yeah, I think that we can look at recent history, and I'll point to our former president, Donald Trump, and I point to his leadership to say that when he prepared to run for office, there were a lot of folks on both sides, lots of political pundits who just sort of said, this isn't going to happen, right? He's not going to be, he won't win. And yet we saw a lot of destruction that kind of happened as a result. And I point to that because I think we can all kind of agree that it was a bit of a shock, and no one really took the candidacy seriously, and at least initially. And so again, from obviously I'm talking about politics here, right? But I think that we have to take some of these things seriously, because the outcome is potentially very, very dangerous. And so I think that we've come so far, and it has taken, quite frankly, a long time to get to where we are now. Just for people to understand that ESG, no one knew what ESG meant, and we're getting to this point where we no longer have to define it in the same ways that we did initially. And so now the pushback starts to happen. I think that should be telling us something, that if we just sort of sit back and wait for someone else to advocate and speak out and collaborate and get together on things that we agree upon, I think it's a dangerous and sort of slippery slope. I will point out, though, that one of the things that I like to talk about with my Republican counterparts is, first of all, we have to have conversations, because if we shut each other down, there's no space for a conversation, right? So I think it's important to be very respectful and to actually kind of agree on the things that we agree upon. So that said, the West Virginia treasurer quite some time ago, actually, I think was one of the first Republicans to sort of step forward and make a real statement about ESG. And one of the things that he was pushing back against was the concept of lost jobs and good wages for coal miners or folks that worked inside of the coal industry. And part of that is because West Virginia, it has a huge part of their economy is dependent upon the coal industry. And when I think about it, that truly is a social, it's a human capital sort of reason to make the claim that you should be investing in different ways. I'm certainly not a proponent of continuing to utilize resources, particularly resources that have a very finite limit. And yet I would just say, hey, that's actually something we agree upon. If we're looking at it solely based upon preserving jobs, good paying jobs, preserving our economy, and again, preserving our economy means that we're supporting small communities that have a hard time finding other mechanisms by which people remain employed. I think that you have to talk about it from that lens and also look at what's the innovation there and how do we innovate to move away from coal and still have good paying jobs. So again, I think you have to take it seriously. You have to be willing to have conversations that are difficult, and you have to be willing to kind of set aside some of your and mine included. But there are things I feel very strongly about, and we sort of have to be able to come together and have a conversation and really think about the ways in which we can agree.
No, and I think when you do that, you can come up with win-win situations. You take a look at the IRA, and a considerable amount of money is being devoted to geographic locations that need to transition from coal to new technology. So to make sure that it's not just that we're getting rid of coal, but in those locations that are reliant on it for jobs and for their economy, that we're really investing in clean tech there so that they're able to basically have good, high-paying jobs that replace the ones that are being lost. But I want to now just turn it back to our colleagues from Europe and say, I will start with Barrister Fiona de Rook. What is your thought on what is happening in the United States, sitting in the UK? And why do you think that the US is an outlier from the rest of the world?
So I in this group, I've already said that I've already said that I think that the US, perhaps it's a cliche to call it a melting pot, but I don't think there's another good way of putting it. I mean, I actually completely concur with what Treasurer Davis has just said. We had exactly the same thing, as Paul will confirm, when our coal industry was simply removed, really destroying probably 3 areas of our society. And if you look at it historically, those are the very areas of society which ensured Brexit. And the reason why they ensured Brexit was because they had nothing. Nobody had actually worked out what to do with spare communities that had lost their identity. So there are all kinds of cultural things that go with this. I mean, I know there are huge downsides in West Virginia. We've all seen the battles that they suffer from certain social challenges and so forth. But I mean, if you take, say, for example, the north of this country, and in particular the northeast of this country, you know, and other mining areas, music went, community spirit disappeared. Unemployment is not actually what makes people feel good. And when you leave people institutionalized in unemployment, they're not happy. They're not ultimately happy. There's a lot of myths in our rather strange and divided society in the UK at the moment, which says, you know, that there are lazy people who can't be bothered to work and so on. It's a sickness that you, if you take a view, well, we're just going to say this is bad for the environment, and so, you know, start something else up. It needs to be done far more carefully than that. You need to provide people with reasonable alternatives. I can sit here as some dozy white liberal in London saying, oh, of course, coal mining is bad and stuff. I would much more be interested in the argument to say that it's not very good for, yeah, exactly. Professor suggests exactly right. But then what do you do instead? You're not just talking about a job, you're talking about ways of life, ways of thinking, community identity, a whole number of things. And you start fiddling around with those that have grown up over decades at your peril. And so there's a way in which I would rather reject the notion of outlier. I could go to the other side of the United States and find people that we speak exactly the same language using the same scriptwriter, or indeed, you know, anywhere further up here, just around in bits of New York. It's just an incredibly big melting pot. And I think that one needs to look at these things very much from the kind of long term that Professor Rajgopal was talking about. You really look at the metrics that go for ages. So you can say, well, okay, it won't change in 5 minutes, or if it will be arterial and savage, and it will yield bad stuff in the years to come. Because I think that the bad stuff from years before is what is actually being visited now upon parts of American society. These are old grievances that were not addressed, just the same as their old grievances in this country, which took us out of the EU, to the greatest detriment of the very people who voted for it. Turkeys and Christmas and stuff. That would be my view. Sorry, maybe not.
No, I think that's a great observation. And you're right. I mean, it is a little bit cliche to say that we're an outlier because, again, we are a melting pot and there are a lot of different views here in the United States. But Paul, I guess my question for you is, how do you view what is happening in the United States, and what are your thoughts on the evolution that you're seeing?
So I think this is one of those cases where we're tricked by having the shared language that we do, that somehow people hear the words fiduciary duty in the UK and Europe, and think we're saying the same thing as that being said with an American accent, and certainly our experience is that isn't the case. You know, we talk to fund managers from around the world. You know, we challenge fund managers from around the world on behalf of our clients, and when we talk about fiduciary duty with US-based fund managers, they mean something very much narrower than I think all of us on this call have been talking about. They tend to go straight to, you have to think about the money, and money in a short-term sense. When we talk to fund managers from Europe and to an extent from Asia and Africa as well, they incorporate that richness that we've talked about, that thought process about those long-term risks. And I think it is just the time horizon issue put into practice, and certainly the conversations that we try and have with fund managers is encouraging the US managers on behalf of our clients to look to that long-term issue, because that's what they and their beneficiaries need from their managers. But at the moment, I think there is, if I accept what Fiona says about the word outlier, but there is a disconnect in the way that we talk about these issues and the way in which they are put into practice in the investment world, at least at the present time.
No, thank you. So I know we have about 5 minutes left, but I do want to give an opportunity for folks to answer questions or ask questions, and for the panel to be able to share their insights and expertise. So to the extent you're able to stay on a little bit longer, our panelists are happy to do so. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn for any questions that we've been receiving.
Thank you, Adam. We have 2 in our Q&A at the moment. Let me just get my screen back. The first one is from Bo Delvey. Please share your thoughts on balancing ESG considerations with fiduciary duty, but really to maximize business return. So the solvency side of things. So on the business return side of things, perhaps I can go to Colleen from the Treasury perspective. Certainly from the financial perspective, and then we can take other questions. Thank you, Adam.
Sure. So, I think that, again, from the fiduciary perspective, it's a pretty easy lens to sort of view the ways in which we seek out ESG considerations. I think the other thing that that is really important is getting an understanding of from our portfolio managers what they're actually doing to pull in some of those considerations, right? And so it's sort of the interest is in the details. And what that says to us from the perspective of a board that is sort of looking at these portfolios, it really gives you a sense of, even if you're not someone who believes in ESG considerations, it gives you a sense of how detail oriented are you and is your portfolio at looking at the true investments and the true outcomes of those investments. And so even if you're taking a step back and saying, well, we're not truly, looking at an ESG strategy, from a fiduciary perspective, you want to know that your fund managers that have an actual strategy to look at that level of detail, right? And so that's kind of what we think about it from that perspective, because even if this is kind of my conversation with folks that are not true believers, is that it tells you something about your managers when they have a strategy.
Thank you, Colleen. Maybe just to ask for Prof. Rajagopal's input on that as well. Thank you.
Oh, in terms of how ESG can be relevant to profits, is that the question?
Yes, to profit, that's right, solvency.
Yeah, again, I think, the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's all about horizon, right? If you're a momentum trader, of course you care about EPS because you care about next quarter's EPS. If you're a long-term investor, you probably care about more things, intangible, difficult, hard to quantify issues that the treasurer talked about that may be linked to future profits and or risk. And to be fair, the other side also has a point. I mean, there are so-called ESG factors that get raised where it's fairly difficult to show a link to value if you look at historical data. So, and I fully echo what, the treasurers said. I often tell people, if there's one thing you can do, go befriend a Republican, get some conversation going and get some agreement going. The other side's not completely off or evil or, as some of my students unfortunately believe. So there is more robust evidence, perhaps linking things like climate, maybe human capital. That's easy. If you treat your employees well, how can that be bad for you? Other things are frankly a bit trickier. I'll leave it at that. Governance to me is highly underemphasized in this conversation and arguably needs to be emphasized much more. In the Republican context, governance is anything that's not illegal as per state law, which is just strange because there are lots of companies where boards are asleep, CEO compensation is out of control, and so on. Anyway, let me stop there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go on to the next
the
question.
one thing, I'm
sorry,
just going to
Adam.
just jump in, and because Professor Bob Eccles out of Harvard and Oxford, I think has a really interesting analogy. He calls a number of the anti-ESG pieces of legislation sheep's in wolves' clothing. And what that actually means is it's a situation, if you actually dig deeper, a lot of the legislation says you can't consider the ESG issues unless you can tie them to pecuniary factors. And I think one of the important things that we need to do as investors and advisors is be able to make the case that focusing on the environment, social, and governance actually can impact your economic returns, either short, medium, or long term. And what that means, I think there is certainly a lot of room for discussion and agreement. Carolyn, back to you.
We're actually out of time now, Adam, and I think that was a very, very rich discussion. Maybe just to conclude and say thank you very much to the panelists. It was really awesome, as people can clap and use your reactions to show your appreciation for the panelists, and my appreciation to everyone online today, and to FinPublica for co-hosting this event. I'm really appreciative of everyone online today. Thank you so much. The recording will be available on the event page, and certificates of attendance will be distributed now. Thank you very much.